To understand Ted Kaczynski, we have to go back. Not to his Montana cabin, not to the bombings, but to a dimly lit room at Harvard University. The fluorescent lights hum overhead, sterile and unblinking. A 16-year-old prodigy sits stiff-backed in a chair, electrodes trailing from his scalp, his gaze locked on the man in the suit before him. The man speaks in calm, measured tones, but his words cut like a scalpel, probing, dissecting, pushing. He doesn't know it yet, but something is about to be taken from him, piece by piece, thought by thought. And when he leaves this room, he will never be the same. Is this what led Ted to commit horrific crimes, or was he born this way? To try and understand how he got here, we will have to go back further, to a boy whose brilliance set him apart, whose isolation grew long before Harvard ever got its hands on him. Ted Kaczynski wasn't just smart, he was off the charts. By the time he was a teenager, his IQ had been measured at 167, higher than Albert Einstein and Stephen Hawking. But genius came with a price. His mind worked at a speed others couldn't keep up with, and it isolated him from the very people he was supposed to grow alongside. By the time he was 8 years old, teachers recognized that his intelligence was extraordinary. Too smart for his grade, they accelerated him ahead of his peers. But while the move made sense academically, socially, it was a disaster. The older students didn't see him as an equal. They saw him as a freak, an anomaly, an outsider. Numbers made sense. People didn't. At home, his parents nurtured his intellect, but there was no warmth, no real encouragement beyond academic achievement. Friends were non-existent. His world was built from textbooks and equations, the only things that made sense to him. By the time he reached middle school, teachers were running out of ways to challenge Ted. While other students struggled with algebra, Kaczynski was studying advanced calculus on his own. In high school, he was taking college-level courses with ease, proving himself a mathematical prodigy. At just 16 years old, he was offered a place at Harvard University. It should have been his moment to thrive, a world-class institution, filled with minds as sharp as his own. But Harvard wasn't a place for him to belong. It was a place that would test him, break him, and whether by fate or design, it would change him forever. In 1958, Ted Kaczynski drifted into Harvard's labyrinth, a freshman lost amid brilliance and covert treachery, not just joining a prestigious university, but stepping blind into a psychological war zone. He sought kin among sharp minds. Instead, he found Dr. Henry Murray, a specter from the ashes of war, a master of psychological warfare whose work echoed MKUltra's shrouded reach. Murray wasn't merely a psychologist. He'd honed the art of breaking men, soldiers, prisoners, reshaping minds for darker ends. Now, at Harvard, he wielded that craft on brilliant youths, pushing them beyond their limits. Ted was lured by whispers of a resilience study, a challenge framed for elite intellects, and spilled his soul onto blank pages. What followed wasn't discourse, but deconstruction. Month after month for 3 years, filmed through lenses lurking in the shadows. His deepest convictions were mocked, his logic dismantled, his identity ridiculed with relentless precision. Humiliation, isolation, overload gnawed at him, a methodical unweaving of a psyche, mirrored in declassified files that whispered of MKUltra's shadow. Government funds flowing into Harvard, testing the limits of the mind. Some whisper of hallucinogens slipped into the mix, shattering an already fragile mind. At first, he resisted, arguing back, clinging to certainty. But the pressure never relented, and doubt clouded a once clear mind. Trust changed into chilling paranoia. Hope withered to dust. The people, the institutions he trusted, all felt like an elaborate illusion, a machine of control. Was Murray following a blueprint or planting a seed of rage? Harvard promised to sharpen minds. For Kaczynski, it may have forged a fracture that never healed. By 1962, when Kaczynski left Harvard, he wasn't just a man with a degree. He was a man with something missing, something broken. For a while, he tried to live the life that was expected of him. With his degree from Harvard and a PhD in mathematics from the University of Michigan, he took a teaching position at UC Berkeley in 1967. At 25, he entered UC Berkeley as the youngest professor there, a rising star in academia. But it didn't take long for the cracks to show. Students found him cold, his voice a murmur, his eyes lost in an eerie storm. Colleagues faded into a hum, their presence a distant shroud. Less than 2 years later, he resigned. No note, just a void. Society wasn't a home, it was a labyrinth. His final lesson wasn't in mathematics, it was in rejection. Society, he concluded, was something he could never belong to. By 1971, he left to find himself into the vast wilderness of Lincoln, Montana, constructing a crude 10 by 12-foot cabin deep in the woods. No electricity, no running water, no form of control. To the outside world, it looked like self-imposed exile. But in Kaczynski's mind, this was more than just isolation. It was liberation. The silence of the forest became his new reality. Winters were merciless, the cold seeping through the cracks of his cabin walls. He lived off the land, scavenging for food, growing what little he could, crafting tools and weapons with his own hands. He spent days in solitude, his only company the thoughts swirling in his mind. And those thoughts were darkening. In his journals, he wrote obsessively about control, about how industrial society had turned people into slaves, how their minds were no longer their own. He wasn't just theorizing, he was calculating. He tested small explosives deep in the woods, not just for destruction, but as proof of concept, a signal that his war on society had already begun. The cabin wasn't just a retreat, it was a workshop for revolution. He was no longer just an observer of the world's collapse, he was preparing to strike back. Kaczynski wasn't merely isolating himself, he was waiting for the right moment to make his words be heard. Ted did find himself, but not in the way society imagines one would find themselves. At first, the bombings seemed random. A professor here, an airline there. The attacks left investigators confused, frustrated. No clear pattern, no demands, no identity. A series of isolated incidents, each terrifying, but disconnected, or so they thought. The randomness of the attacks turned ordinary life into a minefield. Professors hesitated before opening their mail. Airline officials feared the next package might bring down a plane. The Unabomber didn't just injure bodies, he infected minds. A silent war was being waged, and no one knew where the next explosion would come from. But as the years passed and the packages kept arriving, a message began to take shape. These weren't random attacks. This was methodical. This was war. The first device appeared in 1978. A crude homemade bomb hidden inside a wooden box left at Northwestern University. It exploded in the hands of a campus security officer, injuring him but failing to kill. A year later, another bomb was found, this time at an airline. For years, the FBI worked in fragments. They investigated each bombing separately, failing to connect the dots. It wasn't until the late 1980s that they realized this wasn't the work of multiple attackers. This was one man, executing a plan with terrifying patience. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses. The bomber wasn't careless, he was precise. He built each device by hand, meticulously crafted to avoid detection, evolving with each explosion. He was learning, improving, and with every failed attempt, his message grew louder. The first bomb wasn't random, it was symbolic. A university, the very institution that had once nurtured him, but had become a symbol of everything he despised. If technology was the disease, academia was its incubator. The people inside were building the future he feared. And so, they became his first targets. It wasn't money he wanted, it wasn't revenge. It was something much bigger, something far more dangerous. But bombs alone weren't enough. Violence couldn't fully convey his message. To make the world listen, he needed words. Clear, unmistakable words. So in 1995, he made a demand. One that left the FBI and the entire nation facing an impossible decision. He sent letters to the New York Times and the Washington Post, demanding they publish his 35,000-word manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future. If they complied, the bombings would stop. It was an impossible choice. Give a terrorist a platform, or risk more deaths? After months of deliberation and pressure from the FBI, the Washington Post published it. And the moment his words hit the public, they ignited a firestorm. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. That was the opening line, a bold statement. But was it wrong? Kaczynski argued that technological progress wasn't just inevitable, it was destructive. With each new invention, society became more controlled, more dependent, more enslaved. He warned that as technology advanced, human freedom would shrink. That those in power, governments, corporations, elites, would use technology not to improve lives, but to control them. His solution? Rejection. Total collapse. A return to nature before the machines took over completely. The words were unsettling. But what was more unsettling was that some of it made sense. Was he just a delusional murderer, lashing out at the world? Or had he put into words something that many had felt, but never dared to say? The Manifesto had given him what he wanted: attention, fear, a public stage. But it also gave the FBI something else, a way to finally catch him. His brother David Kaczynski faced an unimaginable choice. The words printed in the Manifesto, the unique language, the sharp tone, were disturbingly familiar. They echoed conversations from his childhood. He wrestled with uncertainty. Could his brother really be the terrorist who'd evaded capture for nearly 2 decades? And if he was, could David live with the consequences of doing nothing? After agonizing deliberation, he reached out to the FBI. One phone call changed everything. For weeks, the FBI quietly staked out Ted's isolated cabin in Montana's dense forest, carefully avoiding suspicion. Agents disguised themselves as loggers and locals, blending into the rugged landscape, observing his every move. They watched the small cabin, hardly believing this primitive structure housed America's most elusive bomber. On April 3, 1996, 2 agents and the sheriff approached his cabin, their true intentions hidden of what was about to unfold. Inside, Kaczynski was caught off guard, surrounded by half-built bombs, tools, and journals detailing every meticulous step of his silent war. He cracked his door, poking his head out. The sheriff grabbed his arm and pulled him to the ground. The chase finally over. After 17 years, the Unabomber was in custody. The trial was a spectacle, broadcast nationwide, dissected and debated in every household. The prosecution painted him as a violent extremist, a brilliant but disturbed mind, dangerous to society. His lawyers saw a deeply damaged man, shaped by psychological trauma, perhaps too damaged to even stand trial. But Ted rejected any claim of insanity. To him, it wasn't madness, it was ideology. Accepting insanity would invalidate his message, turning his manifesto from a warning into the ravings of a lunatic. He refused to be labeled as delusional. So in 1998, in a courtroom crowded with media, family, and survivors of his attacks, Kaczynski made his choice. He pled guilty to all charges, ensuring his ideas remained his own, even if it meant spending the rest of his life behind bars. The verdict was swift: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Yet, even as prison doors closed behind him, questions remained unanswered. Was Kaczynski merely a terrorist seeking attention? Or was he the inevitable product of a society that experimented on its brightest minds, pushed too far until they finally broke? And if he was right about even a fraction of what he warned, what does that mean for the rest of us? Decades after Kaczynski's imprisonment, the questions linger. Society branded him a monster, a terrorist, a murderer. But beneath those labels, uncertainty remains. His warnings about technology's destructive path haven't faded. They've grown louder, more relevant. Privacy invasion, mass surveillance, AI-driven decisions. Aren't these exactly what Kaczynski feared? Yet the deeper mystery lies within Kaczynski himself. Did Harvard's psychological torture create the Unabomber, planting the seeds of paranoia and distrust that grew into violence? Or was it always inside him, waiting for a trigger? Was Ted Kaczynski the inevitable product of a society that pushes brilliant minds to their breaking points? Or was he simply the first to break? We may never have a definitive answer, but perhaps that's the point. The line between madness and insight isn't always clear. Sometimes the truths hardest to face come from those we call insane. As Kaczynski spent the rest of his life locked away, society continued hurtling forward, driven by the very forces he warned us against. And we're left wondering, was Ted Kaczynski a prophet, or just a product of a world that operates without oversight?